All right, Judges chapter 3. This chapter actually contains the first three judges of Israel. And in continuing our series with little-known heroes of the Bible, I'd like to talk about Ehud tonight. And if you've never read closely Judges chapter 3 and what Ehud accomplished, it makes for interesting reading. It's almost as if it's a novel and you're reading a mystery novel. And God is talking as we begin the third chapter. Once again, there are pagan nations that are remaining in the territory of Israel. And God said he left those there to verse 1. These are the nations which the Lord left to prove Israel by them, even as many of Israel as had not known all the wars of Canaan. Only the generation of the children of Israel might know to teach them war, at the least, such as before knew nothing thereof. Namely, the 5 lords of the Philistines, all the Canaanites, the Sidonites, the Hittivites, who dwelt in the Mount Lebanon, and the Balaman unto entering Hamath. And they were to prove Israel by them, to know whether they would hearken unto the commandments of the Lord, which he had commanded their fathers by the hand of Moses. And the children of Israel dwelt among, remember, they're dwelling right in the middle of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. That's verse 5. So they are surrounded by pagans. Well, unfortunately, verse 6 tells us the natural occurrence of what happened to Israel over and over again, and most every nation. They took their daughters to be their wives, and gave their daughters to their sons, and then served their gods. Verse 6. And the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and forgot the Lord their God, and served Balaam and the groves. I should have counted up how many times we read that line in the Old Testament, that the children of Israel once again did evil in the sight of the Lord. It just occurs time and time again. And God is patient with them and faithful with them, and he eventually restores them. But all the wasted years, because they simply did not obey his original commandments. They're dwelling in the middle of pagan cultures, and they're listed there. And God, in his inspiring the scriptures, tells us in the first few verses that he left them there for more than one reason, so that Israel would, he could tell if they really loved him and would cling to him and would call out to him. Because, many of their forefathers had seen great miracles, and they knew God was working in their midst. So, number one, so that he could test them, because they'd not, number two, experienced war. He knew in order to survive among these nations that they would have to fight. They would have to do battle. If God fought every single battle for them every single time, there'd be no faith involved. They wouldn't have to exercise their faith. It's really no different with us today. We're to walk by faith, not by sight. So you have a generation whose fathers have died out because of unbelief, and they don't know war. They don't know how to fight. So that was one of the reasons, because God knew, knowing the end from the beginning, that they would have to learn how to defend themselves. So what do? They took daughters to be their wives, they intermarried, and they intermingled, verse 6 says. And it wasn't long after that they began to serve the gods of the culture they were in. They did not stay true to Jehovah. They did not stay true to the one God. You can understand, as they began to intermarry and then have children, and the wives they took, and then the sons they took, the husbands, having different beliefs, that controversy still goes on today. Many times, a husband and wife think, a young couple want to get married, and they have two almost polar opposites of beliefs, and think that won't be a problem. Well, it eventually will be a problem. It will affect the marriage. And that's what happened here. even this many years ago. They did evil in the sight of the Lord. And what was the result? Verse 8, therefore the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, and he sold them into the hand of Cush. Now the rest of that word there just means that they were doubly evil, of Mesopotamia. And the children of Israel served Cush for 8 years. Because of their disobedience, God allowed them to be overcome. And they served for 8 years. That meant that, they were conquered. They had to go by the rules. They had to go by the laws of the Cush, Cushan-Arishathaim, if you look at that word, in Mesopotamia. So they were serving their gods. They had forgot about God, the true God, and now they were under the rule of a foreign power. Verse 9, and when the children of Israel cried unto the Lord, after 8 years, the Lord raised up a deliverer to the children of Israel, delivered them Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, the same Caleb that entered the promised land. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he judged Israel, and he went to war. And the Lord delivered Cush, king of Mesopotamia, into his hand, and his hand prevailed against them. And the land had rest for 40 years, until that judge, Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died. Guess what happens next? Verse 12, and the children of Israel did evil again in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, against Israel, because they had done evil in the sight of the Lord. So our hero of faith for tonight is the man that God raises up to overcome Eglon and the Moabites. He gathered unto him the children of Ammon and Amalek, and went and smote Israel, and possessed the city of palm trees. So the children of Israel served Eglon, the king of Moab, 18 years. So now 18 and 8, that's 26. And they'd had peace prior to that for 40 years in verse 11. So again, the Bible's hitting the topics, and there's a lot of time spanned in between there. But this second judge, his name is Ehud. And he's our hero of faith tonight. Well, what did he do? The cycle had continued. Israel was sold into servitude. They did evil in the sight of the Lord, and got away from their dependence and obedience toward God. Their victory did not automatically last forever each time they were victorious. It had to be maintained. Moab was situated in the east of the Dead Sea between Ammon and Zered, and it was settled as a kingdom some 50 years before the Israelite invasion. So they were established. And then there was the Amalekites, who were akin to the Edomites, and they were a nomadic race occupying much of the area too. So the name of the king was Eglon. Notice verse 12. I found this significant. And the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord strengthened Eglon. This is one of Israel's enemies. The Lord strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, against Israel because they done evil in the sight of the Lord. That just shows me that God was intimately involved, and when he would rise, he could raise a nation up, he could put a nation down. But they cried out to God and said, send us a deliverer. In verse 15, and the Lord raised them up a deliverer, our hero for tonight, Ehud, the son of Gera, a Benjamite, a left-handed man. And by him the children of Israel sent a present unto Eglon, the king of Moab. Remember, even today, 10% of the population is left-handed. So it's very unusual for someone to be left-handed in that day. Well, there's a reason why God chose Ehud to be the hero tonight.
It amazes me when they put those little bits in there like that. He was left-handed.
Yes.
And you're thinking, why? I mean, what?
And the Word of God is about to tell us. It's about to show us why, because that's very good. It was unusual to be left-handed. Usually if you were born left-handed at this time, they forced you to become right-handed. And that even has happened in recent times, I've been told by young people that went to parochial schools especially. It's what they told me. They said the nun said that was the devil's hand and would make them switch over to eventually be right-handed. So it was unusual to be left-handed, even back then. So God raises up Ehud, seemingly out of nowhere, tells us whose son he was, that he was a Benjamite, he was left-handed. And see, when you were conquered like they were, you had to come and pay tribute money to the Moabites. So Ehud got himself an appointment with Eglon, who had been strengthened by the Lord against Israel. So here's what Ehud did. He made himself a dagger, and it was about 18 inches long, if you can picture that. It had 2 edges, so it was a sharp 2-edged dagger. And he girded upon his raiment under his right thigh. I was talking with my wife earlier today about that, of how you would have to reach across if you're right-handed, but there's a reason for it, because it's hidden. And he's going to see King Eglon. Now, of course, King Eglon has his people around him, but Ehud says, I have a message for you, and I have a present for you. And the king says, silence. He didn't want those around him to hear what this message was. This, obviously, Ehud was very clever. So he goes to the Moabite camp. He has a dagger taped to his right thigh, and he's left-handed. So they're not expecting an attack. No one would expect it. They expect a right hand, but he's left-handed. So he turned all the people away that were there. The king said to keep silent and to leave us. Verse 20, and Ehud came into him, and he was sitting in a summer parlor, which he had himself alone. And Ehud said, I have a message from God for you. And he arose out of his seat. And Ehud put forth his left hand, took the dagger from his right thigh, and thrust it into his belly. And the haft, or the hilt of the blade, went in after the blade, and the fat enclosed around it, so that he could not draw the dagger out of his belly, and the dirt came out. This message might be rated PG-13, huh? this Wednesday night. Now remember, he was raised up to deliver Israel from the Moabites. And this was King Eglon. And again, when the Bible gives such detail like this, it's like, wow, to me, it shows its authenticity. First, that Ehud was left-handed. Secondly, that Eglon was so heavy that the blade went in and was swallowed up inside of him. Now, scholars differ on what it means by the dirt came out, but something came out of the wound. Or, this is a little bit gross, a lot of times when a person dies, all their bodily functions let go. Not every time, but sometimes. That could have been what happened too. But in any event, that was the present that Ehud had brought to give to King Eglon. So he then went through the porch, shut the doors, locked them, and he was gone out. His servants came, and when they saw that, behold, the doors of the parlor were locked, they said, surely he covereth his feet in his summer chamber. He's laying down. They're not going to go in and disturb the king. Ehud told the truth when he said, the message was, those who will oppress the people of God touch the apple of his eye and will be judged for it. Bible scholar F.B. Myers set forth some thoughts on Judges 3 and Ehud's statement to Eglon, I have a message from God for you. God's messages are often secret. God's messages must be received with reverence. God's messages leap out from unexpected quarters. God's messages are a sharp two-edged sword and cause death. God's word pierces as a two-edged sword to the dividing asunder of the spirit and the recesses of the being. God uses many messengers to speak to us, including death, and that was the message that he had said that he had to deliver. Many think that it lodged close to his heart and he fell dead. Otherwise he would have cried out and his servants would have came running in. But he escaped. And notice what happens next, to kind of tie a bow around this story. And then we'll take time to discuss it. And Ehud escaped while they tarried. While the servants waited outside, wondering, well, he must be sleeping. The king must be asleep. He escaped. And it came to pass when he was come to the Mount Ephraim, he blew a trumpet, and the children of Israel went down from him, and he before them. And he said unto them, Follow me, for the Lord hath delivered your enemies, the Moabites, into your hand. And they went down after him, and took the fords of Jordan toward Moab, and suffered not a man to pass over. And they slew all of the Moab, about 10,000 men, who were all lusty, men of valor, and there escaped not a man. So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land had rest 80 years.
How long would it have taken to kill 10,000 men?
Very good question, Mary.